Why don't we get started? Welcome everyone as you're coming on to this terrific seminar series which we're having on modeling and the pandemic. We're really pleased today to have Luca Guerrieri from the Federal Reserve Board to speak to us on his new paper, very new paper, Social Distancing and Supply Disruptions in a Pandemic, with Giancarlo Corsetti and Martin Bodenstein. I have to say, this paper is being produced so rapidly, it's mind-boggling. Just earlier this month, Luca was going to present a completely different paper at a conference which we have been holding at Stanford and Hoover for a while, but that had to be canceled. We'll see what happens in the future. But this is done really remarkably fast. It's very important to have this view. Luca got his Ph.D. from Stanford and has contributed so much to so many modeling issues, including Sigma at the Federal Reserve Board. And I have to say, I noticed this paper is already published in a journal called COVID Economics. It must be a record in terms of submission and publication, but it's just an example of how rapidly things are changing. So there's a little place you can put in questions if you have. Q&A, it's on my screen at least. And after Luca presents for 30, 40 minutes, we'll open it up for questions, and we'll be indicating the most popular questions too. So we're about ready. Volker, do you want to say anything to get us started?
No, just also welcome from the Frankfurt side. It's great to have this as part of our macro modeling model and comparison network. And so welcome, and I'm also keen to look and see what Luca and his team have done.
Well, thank you so much. And just to make sure that you don't hold off on your questions, the paper is being included in the COVID-19 journal, but it's just a pre-publication journal. So it's just a slightly vetted working paper series. So all of your questions will be extremely useful as we continue with this project. Again, this is joint work with Martin Bodenstein, also at the Federal Reserve, and with Giancarlo Corsetti at Cambridge, at University of Cambridge. And this is the usual disclaimer that the presentation reflects our opinions and not those of the Federal Reserve. So why is social distancing? At this point, most advanced economies mandate social distancing and other public health restrictions to slow the spread of the pandemic. And a key argument for these measures highlights some important trade-offs. Social distancing, on the one hand, protects capacity-constrained healthcare systems. We think this is just the preeminent consideration when imposing this type of very restrictive measure. Without social distancing measures, healthcare systems may become overwhelmed. In turn, this could increase the mortality rate and the number of infected people as these healthcare systems become strained. But this protection for the healthcare systems and our lives also entails high economic costs. And so one question that we want to tackle is, first of all, could these economic costs be avoided by not implementing a lockdown? That's something that I'll return to in the presentation. How do we do this? Central to our argument is the presence of a core sector in the economy. What do we mean by a core sector? Well, we think about core sector industries as providing essential inputs to other industries that really are an integral part that the economy would miss and would not be able to run if an insufficient number of these inputs were available. So what are some prime candidates? We can't claim that we have the definitive list, but we think we have a good working list. Think about healthcare services, food, distribution services, transportation, sanitation, energy supply. These all seem essential for the running of the economy, but also for the running of other industries within the economy. So the kind of argument that we'd like to highlight is that an unchecked pandemic, through its effect on the labor supply, could incapacitate the core sector of the economy and amplify the fall in economic activity to a really precipitous extent. Now, despite fairly strict lockdowns throughout the country in the United States, we've seen some examples where workers becoming ill have incapacitated some of these key industries, at least locally. So examples could be, for instance, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority in New York that has gone to severely reduced schedules for running some of its trains. But think also about meat processing plants, or at some point, at least according to newspaper reports, the federal government in the United States considered completely shutting down the domestic airspace because so many air traffic controllers were falling sick. So these are the kind of events that we'd like to think within the framework of our model. So to give you an idea in terms of numbers, if we go with our working list of core industries, how much of a fraction of GDP are we talking about? What about as a fraction of employment? You see the bottom line in this last row. If you go by this working list of industries, we're really talking about 27% of GDP, or an even greater share of employment, as high as about 38%. Okay, so what we want to do here is to rethink the health economy trade-off. First of all, by showing you the effect of an unfettered epidemic running through the economy, and then using this multi-sector model to think about more efficient ways of organizing lockdowns. So we are going to feature within this model a multi-group but otherwise standard epidemiological model. So this is one part of the two frameworks that we'd like to bridge. And on the other side, a multi-sector macroeconomic model that, again, distinguishes between core and non-core industries. And so key to our argument is going to be that a fall in labor supplied to the core industries amplifies aggregate economic contractions with two channels. Well, the first channel is that the output of the core sector is not easily substitutable. And then the second channel is that production in the con sector in our model is non-homothetic. So it is subject to a minimum scale requirement. And so what we're trying to capture with this assumption is the idea that production these days happens through specialized teams, whereby if enough workers fall sick, they are not reporting to work. It's going to hamper the productivity of the rest of the team as well. So these are the kind of considerations that we were trying to bring in parsimoniously through these non-homothetic features of our very simple model. So what are the main takeaways from this analysis? So we really would like to highlight the risk of large supply-driven economic contractions relative to a one-sector model. So in terms of just gauging the magnitudes involved, the fall in GDP would reach 30% in our multi-sector model, as opposed to 20% if you go through the lens of a single sector model. Now, we treat the quantities that are coming from this calibrated exercise with a grain of salt. There are many important features that are missing from our analysis, but also there's definitely uncertainty both with regard to the parameters of the epidemiological model as well of the economic model. So we hope that while we might not be providing completely firm numbers, we are at the very least providing a blueprint for assessing structured social distancing, and also devising ways to think about considerations that are important are definitely the interaction between sectors, the substitutability, as well as differences across sectors that have to do with, for instance, the fraction of individuals who can continue working from home while on lockdown. Third, we'd like to put center stage in devising lockdown measures, what we're calling an infection externality. The fact that workers across the population, across industries interact also means that as we put on lockdown certain workers, they are we are reducing the population that is susceptible to the disease, and we are smoothing out the infection peaks. It turns out that this has beneficial consequences also for the workers who are not in lockdown. So a lockdown that is skewed towards the non-core industries is a lockdown that also helps protect the workers in the core industries. So which strategy for social distancing? In this paper, we really focus on an economic contraction due to the incidence of the disease on labor supply. And I mentioned some elements that are in the analysis here. Let me be precise about some elements that are really not in our analysis as well. So we are abstracting from potentially really important features such as precautionary savings. This definitely could make the demand side reduction much larger than what we are showing in our model. We're abstracting from financial frictions. We're also abstracting from possibly imperfect economic policy and other important rigidities. We're also abstracting from uncertainty concerning the spread of the disease, uncertainty concerning the potential immunity from the disease, and uncertainty regarding to the timing of the arrival of a vaccine. Nonetheless, we hope that this analysis is going to be useful and a first step towards addressing some of these additional elements. Now, the main idea is really the differentiated public health restrictions by sector and occupational task can reduce the supply disruption associated with lockdowns. And I try to give you some examples of this tailoring later in the presentation. So something that we consider in the paper is a trade-off between length and intensity of a lockdown. So in our baseline exercise, we are going to start by locking away the workers who can continue working from home and design the lockdowns so as to avoid a resurgence of the disease once the lockdowns are lifted. Now, we could make the lockdown stricter and save even more lives. There are economic costs to even stricter lockdowns. And these are some of the trade-offs that we consider in many of the exercises in the paper. We also try to provide some possible economic costs or a way of thinking about the economic cost of waiting for a vaccine. Some of the considerations that we bring in are picking a certain target for the peak of the infection, and how long and how strict would the lockdowns be? What would be the differential effects on the different sectors, and how would you structure the lockdowns given the economic problem that we wrote down in order to reduce the economic costs involved? So in the rest of the presentation, I'd like to start by showing you our framework and then tackle with the differences between 1 and 2 sector models. Then I'd like to give you some ballpark estimates of the cost of waiting for a vaccine, where the waiting for a vaccine is really done through structured lockdowns that are differentiated by sector. So at the heart of our analysis, the first step is the canonical discrete time SIR model that we are really just lifting from the field of epidemiology. At this point, this model might be second nature to all of you. Let me just review it very briefly. S in this first equation is the mass of susceptible individuals. And employing a concept that in epidemiology is called the law of mass action, we are imposing that there's a certain contact rate beta that regulates how often susceptible and infected individuals produce a new infection. Now, this mass beta into the mass of susceptible and infected individuals, you see it here with opposite sign. It goes to grow the mass of infected individuals. And this mass of infected individuals, in turn, is reduced over time as at a rate gamma, as infected individuals become removed individuals. And removed individuals in our very simple setting are either individuals who have recovered or individuals who have passed away from the disease. Now, two important parameters here, the contact rate beta and the recovery rate gamma. They're central in this basic epidemiological model as, for instance, they influence the basic reproduction number, also known as R naught, which is in this case just a beta divided by gamma. So in this deterministic framework, as long as R naught is greater than 1, we are guaranteed to have a pandemic. So in our baseline, we actually take an R naught that is equal to 4, which is squarely in the range of possible R naughts that is indicated by a growing empirical literature. But there is certainly great uncertainty as to what the relevant numbers are that govern the spread of the disease, even for this very basic epidemiological model. So we consider a wide range of plausible alternatives. So this is just to give you a very quick idea of what in the basic numbers that our calibration implies are. The green path is the path of susceptible individual group canonical model. We start with the entire population being susceptible and being reduced as in numbers as individuals become infected, and then some of them recover. So by the time the disease has run its course and herd immunity is achieved, in this calibration, most of the population has actually gone through, the disease has gone through most of the population. What I'd like to do next is to think about the tailoring of this canonical model to our application. And in our application, it's an application that has multiple sectors. So we really want to split up the canonical model into to deal with 3 groups. So group 1 coincides with the employed individuals in sector 1. Group 2 with those individuals are employed in sector 2. And group 3 are the individuals who are outside the labor force. So we're really thinking here about the young and the elderly. And so you see here that we've maintained the structure of the basic canonical model. We now have betas and additional state variables to track these different groups. But we're going to take an important simplifying assumption. So we are not going to differentiate these betas across groups unless we bring in structured lockdowns. So we are going to assume that the betas that govern the spread of the disease within and across groups are all constant and equal to the beta that I just used in the simulation of the one group canonical model. So we're going to be introducing differentiation, but that differentiation is going to be driven purely by the differential rate of lockdowns across groups. Now, I'd like to tell you a little something about the very simple economic model that we're using. And so here, the model is so simple that the utility function just includes consumption and consumption habits, but labor supply is fixed. And labor supply is going to be varying here simply as individuals going to be under lockdown, or they are going to be temporarily withdrawn from the labor force as they become incapacitated because of the disease. Now, the two different groups of workers pool their income. You can think about workers belonging within a family unit if you want. So that this is their joint budget constraint. And then we have just some very slight complication. We are considering variable capacity utilization, where the rate of utilization U entails some cost. We are also considering that capital could provide such a smoothing mechanism for consumption that if the shock is large enough, we could get to a case in which we are literally eating capital. So what we do is that we also impose an irreversibility constraint on investment so that investment cannot go negative, avoiding this idea that we could be eating the installed capital stock. Now, there's differentiation across sectors. As I mentioned, there is the assumption of a non-homothetic production function in the core sector, but this is something that's very simple. Now, the core sector just uses a labor input, and then this labor input is subject to a minimum scale chi. And this eta here is just so that the choice of chi could be neutralized in the steady state by rescaling with a different productivity factor. Now, the value added of sector 1 is also combined with the value added of sector 2, which is a more standard Cobb-Douglas production function. Again, here you just see the term for capacity utilization, and we are just assuming that there is a CS production function for final output that combines the value added of the two sectors, where rho is the parameter that governs the elasticity of substitution between the two inputs. Now, omega here, if we set it to 1, omega is a quasi-share of the value added for the two sectors. If we were to set it to 1, we'd be just collapsing into a canonical RBC model without the complication of the non-homotheticity and without the complication of the multiple sectors. Now, here, what all I want to mention is that the effective labor supply is going to be given by the group size for sector 1 and sector 2. And we're going to be removing temporarily individuals who fall sick. So the number of individuals who fall sick are this LJ into 1 minus iota, where iota here is the share of individuals who are asymptomatic. So we are not going to be taking out of the workforce the individuals who are infected and asymptomatic in the absence of widespread randomized testing. Okay, so then this is just something about the sizes of the various sectors. So the group 3 is the group of individuals who are outside the labor force. And so we set that at 35%, and that's in line with statistics for the working age population in the United States. So this is just the remainder relative to the working age population. Now, I showed you, let me show you it again, that employment in the core sector accounts for about 38% of employment. So that's how we size this group 1. And the remainder goes into the non-core sector. Okay, so this is, you know, I need to tell you a little something about the calibration. Again, this beta, we set it to 0.2. Gamma is set to 0.05. It means that the average infection duration is about 20 days. I mentioned that they are not implied by this choice of beta, and gamma is 4. We are abstracting for this application from that. So that's a complication that could be of interest, for instance, in formal optimal control exercises, which is not something that we are providing here. Now, an important parameter is the share of asymptomatic individuals. And we are grabbing that out of a study of the Diamond Princess cruise ship. Since then, a few countries have tested a large share of the population, which assuages concerns of non-randomized testing. And the numbers that come out, for instance, from the testing program in Iceland are not too different from this kind of share that we back out from the Diamond Princess study. Okay, so I need to talk about the minimum scale parameter. We set that to a half. The quasi shares are set to hit the population group sizes that I just mentioned, and we take an elasticity of substitution between core and non-core sectors that's equal to 1/3. Now the epidemiological model is calibrated at a daily frequency, and we calibrate the economic model at a monthly frequency, because the only contact is through the labor supply, and the labor supply is exogenous. What we can do is adopt this trick that we can solve independently the epidemiological model at a daily frequency, aggregate to the monthly frequency, and then feed the path implied by the epidemiological model with a series of perfectly foreseen shocks into the economic model. And so that's what we're going to be doing. So the first experiment that I'd like to show you is an experiment that compares the two-sector model to a one-sector model, a special case in which the omega parameter is set to 1. And so here I'm starting from the disease dynamics. Again, we start with a daily model for the disease dynamics, and here we're just aggregating everything to the monthly frequency. So you see here the infected shares. So this is just in the absence of any structural lockdowns. We get to some really high numbers in terms of fraction of infected population. And so here you see the split between group 1 and group 2. So because there is no differentiation in the contact rates, the differences here are merely reflecting the different sizes of these two groups. So moving on to the economic outcomes, so you see here the collapse in economic activity that is here simply caused because a large number of individuals within the population become sick. And you also here see the amplification in the collapse of economic activity that we get out of our two-sector structure relative to a one-sector model. Now, what we find interesting also is that this amplification in the overall GDP collapse is dwarfed by the amplification as far as the collapse in consumption is concerned. So the differential path of consumption is striking across the two models. Where does it come from? It comes from the fact that the collapse is sufficiently larger in the two-sector model as to reach the lower bound for investment. So we hit the irreversibility constraint for investment. In here, you see binding just one period, but that's enough to make investment less of a good vehicle to smooth consumption over time, which then really just delivers a very different path for consumption across the two models. Now, here you see some of the sectoral detail and the fact that the minimum scale requirement is amplifying the collapse in the value added produced by sector 1, despite the fact that the withdrawal in labor supply is the same across the two sectors. Now you see here that the scales are different and the contraction in value added in sector 1 is much deeper, which explains then also in the aggregate picture, this much broader collapse of aggregate output. Now, this chart here is trying to show you that these differences in the economic collapse. So in here, I'm just showing you the average output loss over 6 months that come from either the one sector model or the two sector model. So these differences are going to be differences that stay extant regardless of the contact rate beta, unless the contact rate beta becomes low enough that we don't really have a pandemic anymore. Now, the next exercise that I'd like to show you is one in which we consider some structured social distancing. And so for that, I need to also show you how we model the effects of social distancing in our epidemiological model. So we are going to be assuming that the law of mass action continues to apply, and that as we put individuals across groups in lockdown, so this is the lockdown share for group J, where N bar is the mass of individuals in group J that are in lockdown, then there is a reduction in the ability of the virus to spread. And it's quadratic because the lockdown is reducing both the susceptible population and the asymptomatic infected population that is able to just transmit the virus. Now, this parameter is one that we can use to vary the effectiveness of the lockdown. So imagine that we were able to set the lockdown at 100%, but we still allow individuals to go out, for instance, to buy groceries or do the bare minimum so that they can survive at home. Those activities are going to imply interactions that could reduce the effectiveness of the lockdown. And so a model device that could capture them is a reduction in the effectiveness of the lockdown through setting a parameter that is lower than 1. So for the first experiment, I'm actually going to set it to 1 and assume that the lockdown is completely effective. Now, one of the complications is that I need to track the effect of the lockdown on the labor supply. And something that we do is that we differentiate the groups in the different sectors by their ability to work from home. So this is governed by this parameter upsilon. And if the lockdown is greater than the fraction of individuals who can work from home, it entails a reduction in the labor supply. Otherwise, the max operator kicks in, and there's no reduction in labor supply from the lockdown itself. Now, the other terms are coming in because we also have to take into account that individuals who are working from home could become sick, for instance, or the individuals not in lockdown this last term could become sick and symptomatic, and at that point, they are taken out of the workforce. Now, where do these numbers for the ability of different groups to work from home come from? To us, it was a discovery that, in fact, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has a survey that tracks the ability of workers in different industries to work from home. So this survey is actually the American Time Use Survey. And if we try to tally an average for the workers in industries in our group 1, we come up with about 15% of workers in the group having the ability to work from home. This fraction of workers who can work from home is much higher in group 2. So we start with a lockdown that is just the cheapest way of protecting the rest of the population from infection. We just put on the lockdown the 15% of workers in group 1 and the 40% of workers in group 2 that, according to the American Time Use Survey, can work from home. We also assume that 30% of workers in individuals in group 3 who are outside of the labor force will be under lockdown. And actually, that's in the same proportion as for the overall population. Now, we are interested in a lockdown that once it is lifted, it does not lead to a resurgence of the disease. So for that to happen, this kind of lockdown needs to be in place for 8 months in our model. So first of all, what do the health outcomes look like with this structured lockdown? So you see here with this chart, this is just the basic model without any lockdown. You're seeing that as many as 40% of individuals become infected. There's a substantial reduction even with this very cheap policy. I mean, it's a policy that it's still completely intrusive, but it's a policy that allows people to continue working from home. So here we go from about 40% of individuals with our basic calibration in place to about 18% of individuals becoming infected. And then you see here discontinuity as the lockdown is lifted. But at this point, the population has reached sufficient herd immunity that there isn't a resurgence of the infection rate. Now, another interesting feature of this simulation is that you see here clearly that despite the fact that there's a much greater proportion of workers in group 2 who are protected by the lockdown, the infection shares are not all that different across the two groups. And this is the basic, this is just the demonstration of the basic infection externality that I was mentioning at the beginning of the presentation. It's the fact that as we skew the lockdown towards workers in group 2 and make it more economically efficient, we are continuing to provide protection for workers in group 1 who have a much lighter lockdown in place. Now, in terms of economic outcomes, what's the comparison? So you see here the do-nothing case. Again, this is just the two-sector version that I showed you a few slides ago when comparing it in their case against the outcomes predicted by just a simpler one-sector model. So you see here that just flipping back to this slide, the lockdown has shifted the profile of the disease so that the infection rate is delayed, and the infection runs longer to run through the population because of the lockdown as well. So these are features that are inherited by construction by aggregate output in our model. Now, you see here that at this point we are in this area of the parameter space where the lockdown is both protecting lives and but the lockdown is also protecting the economy. We are reducing the cost of the disease overall by going with the lockdown. So the basic part of this, the basic message of this part of the paper is that health measures and economic outcomes don't necessarily need to imply a trade-off. They're not, the two goals are not necessarily in contrast with each other. Now, the rest of the paper considers a variety of different social distancing measures, but let me showcase one if I still have time. That's one in which we go with a much stricter but shorter lockdown. So in here, as a thought experiment, we are considering putting away 40% of individuals in group 1 and 90% of individuals in both group 2 and 3. Now, this is a lockdown devised so that for the same health outcome, we are skewing the lockdown so as to get the most favorable economic outcome. So we basically want to engineer an effective reduction in labor supply once we take into account the minimum scale requirement that is similar across the two sectors. So the reduction in outputs across the two sectors is going to be very close to each other. Now, the lockdown here lasts for only 3 months, after which all these social distancing measures are assumed to go away. And importantly, we're also assuming that we don't go into unstructured social distancing that is just voluntary. So what happens at that point? I think this picture is quite striking. It shows that by taking these very expensive measures, but just lifting them too early, we have just delayed the course of the disease. So in terms of just peak numbers of infected individuals or number of individuals who experience the disease, you can tell that there isn't much difference between these top two panels. This is the case in which we did nothing. This is the case with these short and intense social distancing measures. So we've just delayed, if you want, in this case, the inevitable. Now, what about the economic outcomes? This is just a prime example of social distancing gone wrong. In this thought experiment, we are experiencing the ravages of the lockdown. So you see here that for 3 months, output goes down precipitously, even more than it would have gone down with the unfettered epidemic. But that eventually, as the lockdown is lifted and so many within the population become sick, there's another recession. And so here we just wanted to highlight the perils of strict but short lockdowns. The last experiment that I think I have time to show you is one in which we try to give you some sense of what are the costs of waiting for a vaccine with a prolonged lockdown. So here we are just going by the idea that a vaccine will become available in 18 months. And that the goal here while waiting for a vaccine is to make sure that the healthcare system does not become overwhelmed. So here we pick a certain infection share that with an expansion in the capacity of the healthcare system could avoid an expansion that we don't think would be implausible, could avoid overwhelming the healthcare system. And we pick lockdown shares so that we equalize the loss in value added across sectors. What's the bottom line? So the bottom line is a reduction of about 20% of GDP lasting for the wait of the vaccine. Now, I also want to show you that, in fact, there's substantial uncertainty over the cost of this wait, just because I think there are two elements that are really important that are reinforcing each other. I think you're all familiar with how little we know about the working of a complex economic system, and that there's usual parameter uncertainty into the models that we build. But here, that uncertainty is interacting in really powerful ways with uncertainty regarding the basic parameters that characterize the course of the disease. So here you see just a really wide range of outcomes. You could get into this horrible green line situation if the effectiveness of the lockdown were not as high as we were assuming in our baseline experiments. Or you could reduce the economic costs if you were willing to skew the lockdown, I think this is intuitive, towards individuals in the population who are not in the labor force. But that might entail social costs that we're just not capturing in this analysis. The pure economic cost, however, would certainly be reduced. Let me just go with our conclusion. In our model, the direct economic cost of the disease really just stem from the inability of symptomatic infected individuals to continue working. Now, if the disease is really just as contagious as our baseline calibration implies, it's going to ravage through the population and build up such a mass of infected individuals in the absence of structured lockdowns that the cost of inaction could just be enormous. part of what we're trying to show is that health outcomes and economic outcomes don't really need to be in contrast with each other. They don't really need to imply a trade-offs. There is a certain area of the parameter space whereby, if you want to put it in those terms, the two policies reinforce each other. The better health outcomes are actually the ones that protect economic activity. Now, here, the one element that was of interest to us was what would be the cost of waiting for a vaccine, given that we have a more realistic sectoral approach to thinking about the economic costs. And there is really more of a blueprint. We think that thinking about the structured lockdowns that are differentiated by characteristics of the population and how they engage in economic activity is a way of thinking about measures that could be as effective but much cheaper. We hope that the kind of analysis that we've started to build is a blueprint for more work along these lines. And that's all I had. Thank you.
Yeah, Luca, thank you so much. The questions are starting to come in, so type in your questions and we'll address them. The results are quite striking. It's in some sense different from what people are out there speculating about, which is important. But let me ask that. There's a sense in which the economic effects that we've seen so far, the high unemployment rate, the lower employment in the US at least, are actually largely caused by the lockdown. And maybe, right? And so where we don't have the evidence of the disease causing this. So so intuitively, it's like the lockdown itself is damaging, and you're not finding that. So could maybe just explain a little bit of that difference?
Yeah, so I think it really just depends on how you are structuring the lockdown, right? Here you see that there are definitely cases in which the lockdowns can cause huge economic contractions. So this is the case of a very strict lockdown that is attempted to safeguard much more than our baseline case, the healthcare system. At that point, I think it's irrefutable that you're going to be creating really large unemployment numbers and just a very large contraction in economic activity. We, however, also wanted to point out that there are some cases, just like our baseline case, in which the health outcomes are not as good as what we are imposing in the scenario in which we wait for a vaccine and impose that these peak infection rates are going to be much more contained than what we can deliver cheaply. At that point, if you go with this much lax lockdowns, we think that it's useful to point out that there's no contrast between the measures, that you can have a contraction in economic activity that's smooth, and that you can also have improved health outcomes towards the do-nothing case. I think it's also important to note that here, we are not attempting to capture the change in behavior that I think is normal to expect, that as you see more cases of infected individuals around you. But one justification for not putting that element front and center in the analysis is that that would just reinforce our case, because it would by itself cause a very large economic contraction.
Right, okay. Thank you. So maybe I should read some of the questions that have come in so we can see it for the record. The first one, which is, why does social distance affect similarly or with the same magnitude, group 1 and group 2?
Okay, that's an interesting question, and that's actually one of the directions in which we are attempting to expand this analysis. The short answer is that if I can go back to the slide that had the basic multi-sector CR model, this slide here, we are assuming that the betas that govern the interaction within and across groups are all the same. Now, is that a realistic assumption? No, we wanted to make that assumption to make contact with the first wave of papers that we've seen in this literature that just uses the canonical CR model. In fact, we know from epidemiological studies that we have different infection rates across different groups in the population, depending on, for instance, age. Definitely different rates of asymptomatic and symptomatic infection. We also know, however, that different occupations entail a different amount of interaction, either with coworkers or with the public. And there's actually interesting data on this differential extent of interaction. For instance, the ONET data set in the United States reports an index of interaction by job because of job requirements. So part of the analysis that we want to do to expand what I've just presented is to differentiate occupations according to this data set, and then also differentiate the industries, given that we also have bridge tables from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that give us a mapping between occupations and industries. So we think that that's additional useful analysis.
So as another, what is the role of the non-core sector in the effects of social distancing in each group?
So we try to give cases that because the core sector is characterized by a greater interaction with the public, for instance. This is one of the differences of these occupations in the core sector. Or think about the food producing industry, in which different workers, we saw, for instance, there was the problem in the meat processing plants, are working right next to each other. So you can think about these just minimum scale assumption that we had in the core sector, capturing part of these differences. I think the importance for the analysis is to try to reflect that we have limited knowledge of how complex economic systems work, and that we might be surprised by the effects of really rapid withdrawals in labor supply. And that given the way that production processes are structured these days, I mean, I can think even about sanitation services. You have some members of a team who are going to be picking up different bins as they come down the various streets of a city. There are others who are just specialized in driving the larger trucks. There are others still who are going to be repairing those trucks as they stop working. So you need all of these members of a team in order for the team to be effective. And so at the point in which there is just a rapid withdrawal in labor inputs, you can have a more than proportionate reduction in output. And unfortunately, we think that you will experience that only at the point, I mean, you're going to actually, you're going to see it when it's obvious rather than ahead of time. And so in planning what lockdowns ought to be, we also think that it's useful to take into account this uncertainty regarding the possibility of much more rapid reductions in labor supply that are in effective labor supply that could be captured by this very parsimonious assumption of a minimum scale of production. But I mean, we recognize that the empirical work that's needed to put some hard numbers on those assumptions is tough, and that however, I think at the point in which you are faced with substantial uncertainty and having to devise some optimal policy, you might want to take into account that kind of situation too.
So there's some questions about other policies. So one is, could your model say something about optimal fiscal policy to reduce the impact of social distancing further? And maybe just any kind of policy would be good in this question.
So I don't think I would use this particular version of the model, but I think there is a nugget maybe in the work that we've done that makes this approach modular. So we try to work hard at containing the epidemiological model on one side. You could basically take our programs and embed them within a much more complex model where basically if you are buying into the idea that you're interested in modeling the reduction in labor supply that comes from the disease incapacitating workers, you could feed that path as a sequence of perfectly foreseen shocks. So that's the kind of structure that we built in. And then it makes this approach modular because you could take your favorite economic model, one that is much better suited to thinking about fiscal policy than the simple model that we were interested in building here, and then consider just a variety of different scenarios there.
So I think you maybe addressed this. What is the effect of allowing the infection and recovery rates to vary by age group?
So I think that would be interesting because if say that you're interested in optimal policies, as for instance, some of the papers, of the excellent papers in this burgeoning literature I've considered, you might want to take into account into your loss function the fact that individuals die at different rates. And so one possibility is, for instance, this is coming out in a paper by Asymptomatic and co-authors that has recently come out, you might want to skew the lockdown rates towards the elderly who are much more likely to die from the disease. Now, I think that that's definitely one of the considerations, and I hope that our approach is complementary to theirs in the sense that we bring in other elements of differentiation through the economic structure, or through, for instance, not in this paper, but the one that we are working to just expand this line of research, for instance, thinking about the contact rates, that would definitely influence the path of the optimal policy.
So I'll read one more and then maybe Volker has a question. What about setting values for the herd immunity effect?
So there is a herd immunity that that is implied by the model. I mean, that's an interesting question, not one I have thought about. So for now, what we have done is to rely on the SIR model to give us an indication of when herd immunity is reached. And so that's going to be different for different parameters within that very basic model. And what I haven't showed you is that in fact, herd immunity is reached at different points, for instance, depending on how we set the contact rates.
Right. Volker, did you want to?
Yes. Two questions. I mean, one question is just about, in this type of model, even if this goes for a long time, we assume that workers and capital and production basically resumes right away. Mm-hmm. But in a sense, the longer we're in lockdown, companies go under. I mean, there are transaction costs to forming companies, and so in that sense, I think there could be a much higher cost to the lockdown when it gets to a point where the number of companies going under is much larger. Mm-hmm. That's one thing. And the other question is concerning your chart you had with the social distancing going wrong. Mm-hmm. Right. Also, the other one, which was interesting, which delaying, and then it didn't help much, but the social distancing going wrong. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, it seems, looking at Asian countries, they did something like that, right? They had pretty sharp responses right away, cutting off travel, cutting off a lot of things. And then infections came down quickly. But then they could avoid the kind of resurgence you have there. At least they could avoid, they switched to other techniques or something. And I thought in a multi-sector model, maybe you can get closer to what those guys did. So those two questions.
No, those are definitely interesting questions. I think there's definitely more to be done in terms of definitely more than we do here, in terms of thinking about the demand side disruptions, for instance, that could definitely go towards amplifying the economic effects. I think to some extent those would also amplify the economic effects of doing nothing. Definitely completely worthwhile extensions, and there are the papers in the literature that are taking the demand side a lot more seriously than we are here. So here we just wanted to have a very parsimonious model in which we were trying to point out that merely looking at the labor supply is enough to get some quite considerable numbers in terms of just economic disruptions. I think taking the very basic SIR model to the data and then eventually understanding the differences across countries is going to be something that it's really difficult in the middle of it. Perhaps as time goes on, we'll have enough data to make sense of the differential experiences across countries. For now, it's really hard for me to tell what's good policy or what's good luck. When I think about it, for instance, the really stark distinction between Italy and Sweden. The policies are completely different. The health outcomes are at this point quite different still. But then I wonder how much of it is just a basic differences in which, for instance, the structure of the economy in Italy is so much more dependent on tourism. And that dependence in here might have, for instance, the contact rates that might be specific to the tourism industry are very different from other industries. Or the fact that you're just so much more open, also in this case, perhaps made you unlucky in that a few individuals could sow the distraction that we saw. But definitely there are similar examples across the United States of states that were much more affected, that have been much more affected by the disease than others. And I'm not sure at this point whether it's just good luck or good policy.
So, Luca, I think we're out of time. We've gone over a little bit. This is fascinating. I appreciate your being here, so to speak, and sharing your views. So good luck with the policy applications.
Thank you.
And maybe that's the hardest for us all at this point, but it's very valuable and terrific paper.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much from my side too. It was excellent. Also great to see other former Stanford students back and now current Fed. I'm a former Fed employee, so fantastic. We should have more of that also in the network. And let me just take the moment before we close. There is another talk coming up next Wednesday with Dirk Krüger, which will focus more on the distributional issues. Health and wealth and the distributional effects. And I think that will also be a fascinating talk 1 week from now. So just to keep you posted. Thank you to everyone. Great to have you. I think as soon as technically we end, everyone will be shut off. So goodbye to Luca. Goodbye to John. It was great seeing you.
Thank you for the forum and the stimulating questions.